Well, friends, in this second lecture on the Westminster Confession of Faith, what I want to try to do is to give you some appreciation of the historical and political factors that led to the emergence of the Confession of Faith. In the first lecture, you may recall I mentioned that creeds and confessions are generally generated by crises, and they reflect those crises that generate them. So in order to understand the confession that we may be studying, it is helpful to appreciate something of what led to it coming into being. And the Westminster Confession of Faith does have a very, very interesting background, and in this particular session, I want to try and sketch that for you. Perhaps the best way of doing that is by building what we have to say around 3 Ps. Firstly, the politics that led to the Westminster Confession of Faith being written. Secondly, the people that were engaged in it. And then thirdly, the productions. So, a little bit of repetition there for you, but hopefully that will give you 3 cluster points around which we can center our thoughts in this particular session. Firstly then, the politics. What fascinating politics created turbulence in England at the beginning of the 17th century. Many of you will know that at the time of the Reformation, the Tudors were on the throne in England, Henry VIII and his offspring. But around the turn of the 17th century, there was a change to the Stuart line, and the first of the Stuarts was James VI of Scotland and the first of England, and he came to power in England in 1603. Now, James Stuart had been raised in Scotland. He had had one of the most able and gifted Scottish professors as his tutor, and he had had a thorough indoctrination in Scottish Calvinism, and he loathed it. And in his heart, he certainly resisted also Scottish presbytery. In Scotland, the church was governed by elders, teaching and ruling elders, who met together in presbyteries and general assemblies. And in the mind of James I, there was far, far too much authority and freedom given to lay rulers and indeed to the people. And he was of the firm conviction, especially in those days when there was such a close connection between the throne and the church, state and church, he was of the firm conviction that if you wanted to have a settled throne, you had to have the reins of the church thoroughly in your grip. So he was convinced that the only stable political situation could be one where the king controlled powerful bishops, appointed them, and then controlled them. So he was what's called prelatic in his sympathies when it came to church government. That word prelatic comes from a prelate, another term for a bishop. He was prelatic in his ecclesiastical tendencies. Anyway, when he became King of England, James I of England, he determined that he was going to consolidate power. Indeed, he believed in the divine right of kings, or monarchical absolutism. Those are a couple of big words, aren't they? But the absolute rule of the monarch. That was his utter conviction. And he set out on a campaign to consolidate absolute power. Now, that brought him head on in collision with the Parliament in England. Perhaps we need to go back a step or two to Henry VIII's day to see the way in which the King and Parliament had interplayed in Britain. At the time of the Reformation in England, Henry VIII was king. Sure, of all the English kings, most people know of Henry VIII. Very, very important, famous king. Henry VIII protested against the intrusions of the Pope into British and English affairs. So he initiated a breach with the Church of Rome, largely on political grounds. So here we are, Henry VIII. A break with Rome to preserve civil or political freedom in England. Now, at that time, the Parliament was very, very keen for that as well. So Henry VIII plus Parliament were very united in those early decades of the 16th century. However, as time went on, and certainly when we came to James I in England, appreciate now that you have got incredible conflict developing between king and parliament. And the reason for that is James wants all the power. Now, siding with James are, who do you think? The powerful bishops. James has given them, or at least has certainly ensured that they have places of dominance and authority and influence and wealth. And they, particularly through Archbishop Laud, in the reign of Charles I, did much to reinforce the authority of the king. And he made great strides towards achieving absolute authority in England. In fact, Charles I completely did away with Parliament for 11 years. One of the ways, again, in which James I and then Charles I established this absolute rule of the king was to just disregard Parliament practically altogether. They dissolved it on 4 occasions. For 11 years, Charles I refused to allow Parliament to sit. He didn't rely on Parliament-authorised taxes for money, at least not at that stage, but on ships' money. So for many years, there was the conflict between king and Parliament, aligned with the king were the bishops, but who do you think was connected closely in supporting the Parliament? Connected with the Parliament, supporting it, were the Puritans, who were the spiritual reformers in the Church of England. King plus bishop, Parliament plus Puritans. There was a tremendous division. King plus bishops had the upper hand until the year 1640. If we can pause for a moment, again, a little bit of backtracking here might be useful. Let's shift away from England again for a moment and go up to Scotland. In the year 1638, the Scots protested against Archbishop Laud and Charles I trying to impose a prayer book, vestments, and other ceremonies upon their worship. The Scots are fiercely independent when it comes to their religion. I'm proud to be one of them. However, Alexander Henderson and others strongly resisted invasive influences. They saw what Archbishop Laud and Charles I were trying to do was take the Church of Scotland back towards the Roman Catholic fold, and they protested. So there was a national covenant signed in 1638, and in 1981, when my wife and I were up in Edinburgh, we went to one of the oldest museums in Edinburgh in the Royal Mile, and there was one of the original half dozen or so copies of the parchment of this national covenant. It had been signed by many in blood. You couldn't distinguish the blood on this very faded parchment, but it had been signed by nobles, dignitaries, great lines of people in Greyfriars Churchyard. Well, what's this got to do with things? Well, the Scots took a strong stand against having ceremonies, prayer books, and other things imposed upon them. And in the end, that led to conflict between the armies of Scotland and England. And in 1640, the Scottish armies defeated the English armies at Newcastle on Tyne. Some of you have perhaps been to Newcastle on Tyne, know where it is anyway. That created a crisis for Charles. He suddenly needed more money than his ship's money could supply, and he had to go to the Parliament to get a law passed to tax the people to replenish the coffers for his army. Got the idea? So he had to convene the Parliament again. And in 1640, what's known as the Long Parliament was convened. Anybody have any idea how long that Parliament effectively was in session? Nearly 13 years. Basically, when the Puritans got the right and authority to have a Parliament, they said, we are going to make this count. And they set about rigorous reforms, both within the state and in the church. Appreciate that? A largely Puritan-dominated Parliament. When it did gain lawful authority to convene, was going to make hay. Ultimately, it was that Parliament that led to Charles I being executed in 1649. But one of the very first actions of the Parliament was to address the authority of bishops in the church. In 1641, they said bishops were no longer allowed to have as much influence in civil affairs as they had had. A seat in the House of Lords. No longer. Or at least it was going to be with greatly reduced authority. Then in 1643, they went a step further and said this, that they were going to dismantle the whole prelatical system of government in the Church of England. In other words, they were going to deprive bishops of their right and authority to govern and rule and discipline in the church. So suddenly, by decree of Parliament anyway, you have a situation where the government, discipline and worship of the Church of England is up for grabs almost, or at least was dissolved. They needed to come up with an alternative. Remember those three things in particular. Not at this stage a new statement of faith or doctrine, but what they did need was a fresh government, a fresh discipline, fresh order of worship. Now, they were wise enough in the Parliament to recognise that they couldn't compile and construct those things unaided just by themselves. So what the Parliament did was call for an assembly of the most learned theologians, pastors and laymen that existed in Britain at that particular time. And in 1643, that assembly of divines gathered and began its work at the Westminster Abbey. That's where the term the Westminster Assembly of Divines comes from. There are differing figures, and at least in the sources I've checked, as to exactly how many men were gathered, but the best that I can come up with, if I can put my finger on it here, is 174. 142 divines and 32 lay assessors. The majority of these men were Puritans in terms of theological conviction. That's then how this assembly came to be convened. It's important to realize that from the outset it was intended to be a permanent consultative committee for the Parliament. The Parliament needed to and wanted to gain insight and help as to how they might restructure the worship and government of the Church of England. And this was the body that was going to help them. Pause for a moment. We needn't for a moment think that the Parliament was wanting to devolve power of self-government back to the Church. No, no. In those days, in the 17th century, Church and state were intimately united together, and the Parliament had no intention of relinquishing ultimate authority over the Church. Their question was, which civil authority was going to control the Church? Was it the King, or was it the Parliament? And Parliament was fully intent on having the ultimate control over the Church. And so it wasn't delegating that to this Assembly of Divines. They were like a select committee that might advise one of our ministers in government. And they were convened for that purpose. Now, they were a very godly group of men. It's always a little difficult to assess from the reports of others as to the learning and virtue of people like this, because people that write about them are oftentimes very, very supportive of them and give these glowing descriptions. One man writes this, he says, without any exaggeration, it may be said that in no previous or subsequent assembly has there been such a galaxy of talent as in the Assembly of Westminster. The members certainly were not men who stood neutral in the national and ecclesiastical struggles. The leading members had all been prominent in these controversies, but they were fair men, not fanatical, amenable to reason and open to conviction, though deeply exercised and already well established in the truth. So they were giants, they were redwoods, if you like, in the faith, and they were also fully apprised of what was happening in the nation and all the issues agitating the land. They were not, perhaps like some of us, a little more withdrawn into our little circle of interest. These were men for whom the issues of the day were very, very close to the heart. So they were towering figures. There's been a collection of the memoirs of the leading members of the Westminster Assembly are published and recently reprinted. It makes fascinating reading. It's profoundly humbling reading to learn at the age at which some of these people were masters of Greek and Hebrew and theology. Absolutely put us to shame. We think our educational system has made vast advances. One only does need to read the lives of some of these exceptional people to realize that there was tremendous mastery of at least basic arts and learned arts at very early ages, back there in the 17th century even. Anyway, we're dealing with a very, very learned body of people who were given the charge of advising the Parliament on the government, discipline, and worship of the Church. Well, the Assembly began the first of its 1163 formal sessions. Think of that. Over 5 years, 6 months, 21 days. 1163 meetings, effectively. Audrey is nearly fainting as she thinks of assemblies of that duration. That's the extent of their deliberations. Perhaps I need to mention at this stage. Although that was the number of formal sessions, not all of the commissioners were present at all of them all of the time. But that's nevertheless the duration of their work. It began with a revision of the 39 Articles, and it perhaps would have continued along that line had there not again been a measure of, I won't say interference, but again involvement from Scotland. Dear old Scotland always had a way of getting itself enmeshed in these things. What happened was, in 1643, the same year when the Assembly was convened, the Parliament approached the commissioners up in Scotland with the request for the help of Scotland. They needed Scotland's help against the king and his forces as they were beginning to polarize. Now, Scotland was basically very loyal to the king. Scotland had no real argument with the king per se. And had the king stayed in his domain and not intruded into the domain of the church, the Scots would have been very, very happy to continue without any resistance. If I can just go back a little bit, during that Second Reformation period in Scotland, the Scottish Covenanters had a catch cry which was to the effect, there are two kings and two kingdoms. There is the kingdom of Christ, of whom Christ alone is king. And there is the kingdom of Caesar, of whom Caesar is king. Now, it was because James I, or Caesar, had intruded into the kingship of Christ that the Scots rebelled and eventually took to arms to preserve that liberty. But they had no quarrel with James I being their legitimate monarch. And again, Alexander Henderson and these other men confessed their loyalty to the king in language and terms that we would think was almost fawning today. Anyway, when the Parliament, the British Parliament, and if I can just try and draw these little pictures, when the Parliament in Britain went up to Scotland and said to the commissioners of the Scottish Parliament, come and help us against the king, the Scottish commissioners said, we will only help you in matters of ecclesiastical reform. We don't want to defy our sovereign in legitimate civil affairs, but we are completely opposed to the meddling that he and the archbishops undertake in our most holy religion. So they said, we will help you, but our help is conditional upon there being a religious covenant that binds us together and essentially a religious purpose in the reforms that we undertake. And that led to the well-known Solemn League and Covenant. Which was agreed upon again in the same year, 1643. And in this way, the Scots became allied to the Parliament in seeking to bring about substantial and significant religious reforms in England, or in Britain as a whole. Now, again, the Scots took some aggression in this whole matter, and they said, there are 4 areas in which we want uniformity, or we want reform to bring the churches in the United Kingdom closer together. Number 1, we want closer conformity and uniformity in our confessed doctrine. Secondly, we want closer uniformity in the way we worship. Thirdly, closer uniformity in the way our churches are governed. And fourthly, closer uniformity in a catechetical form of teaching people the Christian faith. So, suddenly the Parliament found its ecclesiastical program enlarged. Not simply now were they trying to bring about reforms in worship, in government, and in discipline in the Church of England, but they had the added requirement to try to come up with a basis of uniformity that could link all the churches in the United Kingdom with Scotland and with the continent more closely. So back to the drawing board they went. And augmented by 6 of Scotland's greatest sons of this period, and they were magnificent men, Samuel Rutherford. Some of you may have heard of the Letters of Samuel Rutherford. There's a great hymn that we sing, written by Anna Cousins, called Rutherford's Hymn, The Sands of Time Are Sinking. Rutherford was one. Gillespie was another, a brilliant young theologian. George Gillespie, it's a pity he died in his early 30s. He was one of Scotland's brightest theologians. There was a lawyer, Warriston, Lord Maitland, Robert Bailey, and Alexander Henderson. These 6 men came and joined in with the Westminster Assembly of Divines and helped them in their deliberations. Now, as I say, there was a broadened agenda that they had before them. Not simply government, not simply discipline, not simply worship, but also, in addition, a confession of faith was needed and catechisms too. And that really is how the Westminster Confession of Faith came into being. The Scots demanded, as part of the condition for an alliance, that there be a common confessional basis between them. And so the Assembly began its many, many sessions working on that. Have you been able to follow that rather meandering journey, which helps you see and understand what it was that eventually led to the formation of a Westminster Confession of Faith? It wasn't just the political tensions between King and Parliament. I mean, that was the initiating thing. But perhaps more than anything, it was the Scots' insistence that there be such a statement. Well, so much for the politics, so much for the people involved. What about, lastly, looking for a few moments at the production of the Westminster Assembly of Divines? In keeping with the requirements of the Solemn League and Covenant and the agreement with the Scottish Commissioners, the Westminster Assembly of Divines did set out to achieve 4 things: a directory for worship, a confession of faith, a form of government, and teaching catechisms. Let me just explain a little for a moment or two the process that they went through in the formation of the Westminster Confession of Faith. And I mention this simply to give some appreciation of how thoroughly this process of formulation took place. We begin up the top of our board here with approximately 170 delegates or commissioners to the Assembly. From that 170, there was a committee formed that was entrusted with coming up with the main heads of doctrine. To be articulated, defined, elaborated upon. There are, if I can recall correctly, I'm pretty sure there's 33 chapters in the Westminster Confession of Faith, and each corresponds, in fact I've got it here, haven't I? I'll just check on that. 33. Each corresponds to a major area of doctrine. So the first step was, this committee came up with these heads of doctrine. Then that committee was augmented by more of the original delegates and split up into a whole number of study committees that took some of these heads of doctrine and went away and worked on them. Then, when that committee, in consultation with other creeds, confessions, etc., had debated and discussed and expressed things as cogently and concisely as they could, they went back to the General Committee, which then made recommendations, which sent it back down here for revisions and corrections. It came back a second time to this General Committee, and then, if approved, went for debate with the whole Assembly, 170. So there were checks and balances. This wasn't something dreamt up overnight. As a result of that, I think we can say and appreciate that there is nothing in the Westminster Confession of Faith that was not subject to the most intense scrutiny, vigorous debate, and careful expression that those men could possibly muster. And without in any way wanting to attribute infallibility or suggest for a moment that the confession of faith stands on a par with the Scriptures, nevertheless, I think we ought think 2 or 3 times before we lightly dismiss the fruit of the scholarship of these men. For years, 3 years, they wrestled and grappled with this. It was eventually November 1646 when the confession itself was completed, and it had gone through numerous revisions, polishings, etc., before that assembly was satisfied with it and made its presentation of it to the Parliament. So as I say, I think we can and ought to have a deep appreciation for the work, the accuracy, and the significance of those statements as they do exist today. Well, what happened? The confession, as I say, was presented to the Parliament because, remember, the Assembly of Divines was ever just a consultative committee, and it had to convey its work to the Parliament, but the Parliament was under no obligation to receive it or submit to it. And the history of the Westminster Confession of Faith in England is one which must have been somewhat discouraging for some of these men here, because it was never universally and widely accepted in England. It was in Scotland, and subsequently has been the foundation of Presbyterian churches that grew out of or came from Scotland ever since. But not so in England and in the United Kingdom at large. So churches of Presbyterian Reformed heritage have absorbed, adopted, and valued and benefited from those years of labour, but many others in England did not. Well now, I hope that gives you a little bit of a picture of the circumstances behind this. I guess the 2 things that I wanted to leave you with in giving you this kind of overview were, number 1, the complexity of the circumstances which gave rise to the confession. It wasn't a simple single issue like the Trinity that was under dispute in those early centuries. It was more political, ecclesiastical, conflicts, tensions, and struggles that gave birth to the confession of faith. And that's reasonably complex. But the second thing I wanted to leave you with was this: some appreciation of the effort, energy, and ability that was invested in the Westminster Confession of Faith when it was framed. And I would really end this session in much the same way that I did the first, namely by saying this, that to treat lightly and to dismiss lightly those labours and the fruit of those labours, I think, is to sell ourselves terribly, terribly short. Perhaps I can just end again with a quotation from John Murray. If I can put my finger on this. Yes, I thought this was a very, very perceptive comment he made. He said, "Christian thought may never be stagnant." By that, what he is saying is this: we must never ever presume that at any point in history the last word has been said concerning all that the Scripture teaches. We must always be going on developing and ever seeking to deepen and enrich our understanding of the Scriptures. So he says, Christian thought may never be stagnant. When it ceases to be progressive, it declines. So he's arguing we've got to carry on and not be carry on in this whole process of theological thinking and development. But he says this: but we do not make progress by discarding our heritage. We build upon it, or more accurately, we grow from it. Now that's tremendously important. Let me read that statement again. We do not make progress by discarding our heritage. We build upon it, or more accurately, we grow from it. I think one of the tragedies that we witness in society today is a general retrogression or regression in many areas of skill, ability, order, and discipline. And part of the reason for that is an absolute throwing over of respect for heritage. I know that if, growing up on the farm, I had never taken any notice of my father, who had learned from his father, who had learned from his father, who had learned from his father, I know that I would have been at a complete loss. I wouldn't have known how to tie a fencing knot. I wouldn't have known easily how to leg rope a cow properly. Hosts and hosts of things. We make progress not by discarding heritage, but building on it or growing from it. And I think that's a challenge that confronts us today. Rather than discarding things like the Westminster Confession of Faith, it ought be part of the staple learning of a new generation of Christians that we can bring our extra resources, our technology, our fresh insight through the Spirit and Word to the ever-progressing development of biblical truth. So, as I said earlier and in the first lecture, I am a great advocate of not forgetting the things that are past. We enter into the labours of others, and in the measure we respect and honour them, we can hope to make progress from them. Well, thank you again for your attention and interest.